For 7 years, Elena has lived in perfect solitude in her grandmother's cottage, hidden deep in the whispering woods where no roads lead and no maps mark the way. She tends her herb garden, reads by candlelight, and asks nothing from the world that forgot her long ago. Her days follow the same gentle rhythm until the night everything changes. When thunder splits the sky and rain lashes her windows, a knock echoes through her sanctuary. At her door stands a figure from nightmares and legends, Dimitri Volkov, the alpha vampire whose name is whispered in fear across kingdoms. Wounded, desperate, and more dangerous than any storm, he asks for something no one has ever dared request from the most feared creature of the night: shelter. What could drive the most powerful vampire alive to seek refuge with a mortal woman who has nothing to offer but sanctuary? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elena's fingers trembled as she touched the silver cross at her throat, the one her grandmother had pressed into her palm 7 years ago with urgent whispers about protection and bloodlines. The creature before her leaned heavily against the doorframe, his dark coat soaked through with rain, and something darker that might have been blood. "You know what I am," he said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries, despite appearing no older than 35. His pale skin seemed to glow in the lamplight, and his eyes held depths that made Elena think of winter nights and ancient sorrows. "I know the stories," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. The cottage around them seemed to hold its breath, the very walls aware of the threshold being crossed. "My grandmother told me about the old bloodlines, about things that hunt in darkness." Dimitri's lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "And yet you opened your door." Elena stepped back, allowing him entry, though every instinct screamed against it. As he crossed the threshold, she felt something shift in the air, a subtle electric charge that made her skin prickle. The ancient threshold stone beneath the doorway, carved with symbols her grandmother claimed were older than memory, began to emit a faint blue glow. "The cottage won't let you harm me," she said with sudden certainty, understanding flooding through her like recognition of a half-remembered dream. "That's why you had to ask permission. That's why you're here instead of somewhere else." Dimitri paused in the entryway, water dripping from his dark hair onto the worn wooden floors. "Your grandmother was wiser than most mortals. This place—" He looked around the small kitchen with its dried herbs hanging from the beams, the copper pots that had served generations of women, the windows that never seemed to let in quite enough light during the day, but somehow felt warm and welcoming now. "It remembers what the world has forgotten." Elena closed the door against the storm and turned to study her unexpected guest. In the lamplight, she could see the exhaustion that carved lines around his eyes, the way he favored his left side as if nursing an injury. His clothes, though expensive, were torn in places, and that dark stain she'd noticed was definitely blood. "You're hurt," she observed, surprising herself with the compassion in her voice. 7 years of solitude had not dulled her instincts to heal. "It will pass." Dimitri's response was automatic, the dismissal of someone unaccustomed to accepting help. But as he moved further into the cottage, Elena saw him wince. "Sit," she commanded, gesturing toward the sturdy wooden chair by the fireplace. "Let me at least clean the wounds." "I don't think you understand what you're offering," Dimitri said, but he sank into the chair with obvious relief. "I'm not safe company for mortals." Elena moved to the kitchen, gathering supplies her grandmother had taught her to keep ready: clean cloths, water from the well that never ran dry, herbs that grew wild in the forest but somehow knew to flourish in her garden. As she worked, she felt the familiar calm that came with purposeful action. "My grandmother used to say that sanctuary was a choice," she said, warming water over the fire. "Not just a place, but a decision to offer shelter even when, especially when, the world tells you not to." She approached him carefully, noting how he tensed despite his obvious pain. Up close, She could see that his skin held an otherworldly pallor, and his dark hair seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But it was his eyes that held her, ancient, weary, and holding secrets that could fill lifetimes. "Why here?" she asked softly, as she began to tend to a gash along his collar. "Of all the places you could have gone, why my door?" Dimitri was quiet for so long that Elena thought he wouldn't answer. The storm continued to rage outside, wind howling through the trees that surrounded the cottage like protective sentinels. Finally he spoke. "Because 7 years ago, a dying woman made me promise something," he said. "She told me that if darkness ever threatened to consume everything, I should find the cottage where her granddaughter kept the old ways alive. She said you would know what to do when the time came." Elena's hands stilled. "My grandmother spoke to you." "In her final hours, yes. She saw what was coming. Hunters, war, the end of the careful balance that has kept our worlds separate." Dimitri met her eyes. "She said you were the key to something greater than either of our kinds understood." Outside, lightning illuminated the forest, and Elena thought she saw shapes moving between the trees that were too tall to be deer, too purposeful to be anything innocent. Elena worked in careful silence, cleaning the wounds that marred Dimitri's pale skin. Each cut seemed deliberate, precise, not the random tears of an accident, but the calculated work of someone who knew exactly how to hurt a creature like him. The herbs her grandmother had taught her to use for healing seemed to respond more readily than usual, their natural properties enhanced by something she couldn't name. "Silver," Dimitri said quietly, watching her tend to a particularly deep gash along his shoulder. "The weapons were blessed by priests and dipped in holy water. They burn in ways that ordinary metal cannot." Elena's fingers hesitated over the wound. She could see now that the edges held a strange, almost crystalline appearance, as if the flesh itself had been transformed by whatever had caused the injury. "Who did this to you?" "The Brotherhood of Light." Dimitri's voice carried centuries of weariness. "Vampire hunters who believe they're doing God's work by eradicating my kind from the earth. They've been tracking me for weeks." As Elena applied a poultice made from herbs that seemed to glow faintly in the firelight, she noticed something that made her breath catch. On Dimitri's left hand, he wore a ring unlike anything she'd ever seen. Black stone, shot through with veins of silver, set in metal that seemed to shift between pewter and gold, depending on how the light struck it. "That ring," she said, unable to keep the awe from her voice. "It's beautiful." Dimitri followed her gaze, and his expression grew guarded. "It marks me as alpha of my clan. Every vampire who serves under my protection bears my symbol." He flexed his fingers, and Elena saw the stone pulse with an inner light. "It also binds me to responsibilities I sometimes wish I could abandon." "You're not what I expected," Elena admitted, surprised by her own boldness. Growing up on her grandmother's stories, she'd imagined vampires as monsters, beautiful perhaps, but fundamentally inhuman. Dimitri was dangerous, certainly, but there was something profoundly lonely about him that called to the part of her that had spent 7 years in self-imposed isolation. "What did you expect?" "Something less," she searched for the right word, "burdened." "The stories make vampires sound powerful, free from human concerns." Dimitri's laugh held no humor. "Power without purpose is just destruction. Freedom without connection is just emptiness. I've had centuries to learn that immortality means nothing if you have no reason to continue existing." Elena found herself studying his face as she worked, noting the sharp angles of his cheekbones, the way his dark lashes cast shadows on his pale skin. But it was the sadness in his eyes that held her attention, an ancient grief that spoke of losses too numerous to count. "The Brotherhood," she said, returning to safer ground. "How close are they?" "Close enough that I couldn't risk leading them to any of my safe houses. Close enough that I had to choose between fighting them with an injury that would likely prove fatal or trusting in your grandmother's dying words." Dimitri winced as Elena cleaned a particularly deep cut. "I chose to trust." As she worked, Elena noticed something strange. The herbal remedies she was applying seemed more potent than they should be, healing the wounds faster than any natural medicine could account for. The plants themselves had grown unusually well in her garden this year, thriving in soil that shouldn't have supported such abundance. "There's something different about you," Dimitri observed, his voice carefully neutral. "Your touch. It carries power that most mortals don't possess." Elena's hands stilled. "What do you mean?" "The healing. It's not just the herbs, it's you. Your grandmother saw it, didn't she? That's why she prepared you for this moment." Before Elena could respond, a sound from outside made them both freeze. It was subtle, the crack of a branch under someone trying very hard to move silently, the whisper of fabric against bark. But in the sudden stillness that followed, it might as well have been a shout. Dimitri was on his feet instantly, moving with fluid grace despite his injuries. "They've found me." Elena felt her heart begin to race, but underneath the fear was something else. A strange calm, as if she'd been preparing for this moment her entire life without knowing it. "What do we do?" Dimitri's eyes met hers, and she saw surprise flicker across his features. "We, Elena, these are trained killers who won't hesitate to destroy anyone who aids their target. This is my home," she said firmly, touching the silver cross at her throat. "My sanctuary. And my grandmother didn't teach me about protection, just so I could hide when it was needed." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but Elena could feel other presences moving through the darkness, hunters who had tracked their prey to what they believed would be his final refuge. Elena's breath caught as she saw what Dimitri was trying to conceal, a silver dagger still, embedded deep between his shoulder blades, its ornate handle protruding like an obscene flower blooming from his flesh. The metal gleamed with an unholy light, etched with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the firelight. "How long has that been there?" she whispered, reaching toward it instinctively before Dimitri caught her wrist. "Don't touch it," he said sharply. "The blade is consecrated. It will burn you as surely as it's poisoning me." Elena pulled her hand back, but her eyes remained fixed on the weapon. The symbols carved into the handle were familiar. She'd seen them in her grandmother's journals, sketched alongside warnings about the Brotherhood of Light. "I know this mark," she said, moving to the old trunk, where her grandmother had kept her most precious books. Grandmother drew it dozens of times. She returned with a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age and filled with her grandmother's careful handwriting. Dimitri leaned forward despite his pain as Elena opened to a page covered with symbols and notes. "The Brotherhood of Light," Elena read aloud. "Founded in 1203 by monks who believed vampires were demons escaped from hell. They consecrate their weapons with holy water and the blood of martyrs." She looked up at Dimitri with growing alarm. "It says here that their daggers are designed to slowly poison vampires, keeping them weak enough to capture alive." Dimitri's jaw tightened. "They don't want to simply kill me, Elena. They want to make an example of me. The alpha vampire brought low and executed in front of my entire clan. Then we remove it," Elena said with a determination that surprised them both. "If you touch that blade." "I won't touch the blade." Elena moved to her kitchen, gathering supplies with swift efficiency. "But I can work around it. My grandmother taught me about drawing poison from wounds." As Elena prepared her remedies, Dimitri studied the journal she'd left open. "Your grandmother knew more about vampire lore than most scholars who've spent lifetimes researching my kind." How? Elena paused in her preparations. It was a question she'd wondered about herself, especially during the long, quiet years since her grandmother's death. She said our family had always been keepers of the old knowledge, guardians of the balance between worlds. Guardians, Dimitri repeated thoughtfully. That would explain the cottage's protections, your healing abilities, the way the threshold stone recognized my nature but allowed me entry. Elena returned to him with a bowl filled with a mixture that glowed faintly green in the dim light. "This will draw the poison out, but I need to work quickly. The longer that blade stays in your body, the more it will spread. as she began her work, carefully applying the remedy around the dagger's entry point without touching the consecrated metal. Elena felt power flow through her hands, not her own power, but something that had been passed down through generations of women who had stood between the supernatural world and chaos. "There's something else," Dimitri said, through gritted teeth as the medicine began to burn away the poison. "The Brotherhood doesn't usually work alone. If they've tracked me here, they'll have backup contingency plans." "What kind of contingency plans?" "The kind that ensure no witnesses survive to tell tales about their methods." Dimitri's eyes met hers. "Elena, harboring me has made you their enemy. Even if I leave now, they won't let you live." Elena's hands never faltered in their work, though she felt ice settle in her stomach. "Then leaving isn't an option, is it? I could try to draw them away, with a consecrated blade poisoning your system. You'd be dead within a mile." Elena applied more of the remedy, watching as it continued to neutralize the poison spreading from the wound. "Besides, this is my home. I won't be driven from it by fanatics who think they understand God's will better than God." A new sound from outside made them both tense, the soft whistle of a bird that no forest bird would make in the middle of a storm. Dimitri's expression grew grim. "Signal call. They're coordinating their approach." He tried to stand, swaying slightly as the poison fought against Elena's treatment. "How many entrances does this cottage have?" "3, front door, back door, and the cellar entrance." Elena steadied him with a hand on his arm, surprised by the cold strength she felt there. "But Dimitri, this cottage has been protecting people for generations. My grandmother didn't just teach me to heal, she taught me to fight," as if summoned by her words. Elena felt something shift inside her, a power awakening that had been sleeping since her grandmother's death. Outside, she could hear footsteps circling the cottage. But for the first time since opening her door to the storm, she wasn't afraid. Elena moved with purpose, born of instinct, her hands finding their way to a hidden panel in the cottage's stone foundation that she'd never opened, but somehow knew was there. Behind the panel lay books that predated her grandmother's journals, texts bound in leather that felt ancient beneath her fingers, their pages filled with symbols that seemed to glow in response to her touch. "What are you doing?" Dimitri asked, his voice strained but curious as Elena selected a particular volume from the collection. "Something I should have done years ago." Elena opened the grimoire, its pages revealing detailed diagrams of protective wards and defensive spells. "My grandmother tried to teach me this before she died, but I was too frightened, too focused on grief to understand what she was offering." The knowledge flowed back to her now, like water finding its course. How to activate the cottage's ancient defenses, how to channel the power that ran in her bloodline like a hidden river waiting to be discovered. She could feel Dimitri watching her with growing amazement as she moved through the cottage, touching specific stones in the walls, whispering words in a language she didn't remember learning. "Your family weren't just guardians," Dimitri realized, his voice filled with awe. "You're descendants of the first peacekeepers, the mortals who negotiated the original treaties between humans and the supernatural world." Elena paused in her preparations. "Is that why you knew to come here? Why my grandmother spoke to you? The peacekeepers were legends even in my time, mortals born with the ability to bridge worlds, to stand between humans and supernatural beings without being consumed by either." Dimitri struggled to his feet, the poison finally beginning to recede under Elena's treatment. "They disappeared centuries ago. We thought the bloodline had died out. Maybe it just went into hiding." Elena touched the final stone in the sequence, and the cottage responded like a living thing awakening from sleep. The walls began to emit a soft protective glow, and she could feel the boundaries of the sanctuary expanding beyond the physical structure to encompass the entire clearing. Outside, the hunters' signals had grown more frequent, more urgent. Elena could sense them testing the edges of the cottage's defenses, probing for weaknesses like wolves circling a campfire. "They can't enter the protected area," she said with sudden certainty. But they can wait us out, and they can—" Her words were cut off by the sharp crack of gunfire. Something struck the cottage's protective barrier and dissolved in a shower of sparks. But the impact sent tremors through the magical defenses that Elena felt in her bones. "Blessed ammunition," Dimitri said grimly. "They're testing the strength of your protections." Elena moved to the window, staying carefully out of sight as she peered into the storm-lashed darkness. She could see muzzle flashes now, the hunters growing bolder as they realized they were dealing with more than just a simple hiding place. "How many?" Dimitri asked, joining her at the window. "6, maybe 7. Elena counted the flashes of light. "They're spread out around the cottage in a complete circle. Professional formation. They've done this before." Dimitri's expression was grim. "Elena, I need you to understand something. Even if your defenses hold, they won't simply give up and leave. The Brotherhood has resources, patience. They'll call for reinforcements, siege equipment, whatever it takes." Elena felt a surge of anger that surprised her with its intensity. This cottage had been her sanctuary, her refuge from a world that had taken everything she loved. Now strangers with weapons and religious conviction thought they could violate that peace, destroy what generations of her family had protected. "Then we don't wait for them to escalate," she said, moving back to her grandmother's hidden collection. "We take the fight to them. Elena, no." She pulled out another book, this one filled with offensive spells rather than defensive ones. "You said my grandmother prepared me for this moment. Maybe this is what she saw coming, not just your arrival, but the need to fight for the balance she spent her life protecting." As Elena began to study the offensive capabilities at her disposal, she felt power building inside her like pressure behind a dam. The cottage itself seemed to approve, its ancient stones humming with energy that had been dormant for too long. Another volley of blessed bullets struck the barrier, and this time Elena felt the impact not as a threat, but as an insult. These hunters thought their righteousness gave them the right to destroy anything they didn't understand, to murder in the name of their god. They have no idea what they're facing, do they? Elena asked, looking up from the grimoire with eyes that now held their own inner light. Dimitri stared at her, and she saw something in his expression she hadn't expected. "Hope." "No," he said softly. "They think they're hunting a wounded vampire and his mortal ally. They have no idea they've challenged the last guardian of the old ways." The attack came at dawn, when the storm had finally begun to weaken and pale light filtered through the clouds. Elena sensed them before she saw them. 7 figures moving through the forest with the coordinated precision of soldiers, each one carrying weapons that gleamed with more than just metal's natural shine. "They have a communion stone," Dimitri said, his enhanced senses picking up what Elena's growing abilities had detected. "See how they move in perfect synchronization? The stone allows them to share thoughts, coordinate their assault without speaking." Elena watched from behind the cottage's protective barrier as the hunters took their positions. Their leader, a man with steel-grey hair and eyes like winter ice, held a crystal that pulsed with pale blue light. Each time it flashed, the other hunters moved as one, adjusting their positions with inhuman precision. "We could wait them out," Elena said, though her voice lacked conviction. The cottage's defenses were strong, but she could feel the strain of maintaining them against the constant probing attacks the hunters had launched throughout the night. "They know that's what we're thinking," Dimitri moved to a different window, studying the hunters' formation. "Look at their positioning. They're not just surrounding us, they're funneling us toward a specific escape route." Elena followed his gaze and saw what he meant. The hunters had left an apparent gap in their circle, a path through the forest that looked like freedom, but was almost certainly a trap. "The communion stone works both ways," she realized. "If we can disrupt it, their coordination collapses." Dimitri nodded approvingly. "But getting close enough to the leader would require me." Elena moved to her grandmother's grimoire, finding the pages she needed. "The cottage's defenses extend beyond the building itself. I can move through the protected area without being detected. at least until I'm close enough to strike. Elena, these are trained killers. You may have power, but you don't have experience using it in combat. Elena looked up from the spell she was studying, her eyes meeting his with newfound determination. Then it's time I learned. The spell she'd chosen was one of concealment, not invisibility, but something subtler. It would make her blend with the natural world, become part of the forest itself while she moved. As she began the incantation, Elena felt the cottage's power flow through her, amplifying her natural abilities until she could sense every living thing in the woods around them. The leader is the key, Dimitri said, as Elena prepared to leave the cottage's safety. Destroy the communion stone, and we can face them one at a time instead of as a coordinated unit. Elena nodded, but as she reached for the door, Dimitri caught her hand. His skin was cold, but she felt warmth in the gesture, concern that surprised them both. If something goes wrong, he began. It won't. Elena squeezed his hand briefly, marveling at how natural the contact felt despite everything that separated them. Trust the cottage. Trust me. She slipped out into the pre-dawn forest, the concealment spell wrapping around her like a second skin. The hunters, focused on their prey trapped inside the cottage, never noticed her passage. Elena moved through the undergrowth with a grace she'd never possessed before, the forest itself seeming to aid her passage. The leader stood 30 yards from the cottage, his attention fixed on the crystal in his hands. Up close, Elena could see that the communion stone was more than just a communication device. It was a weapon in its own right, channeling the combined faith and hatred of the Brotherhood into a force that could shatter supernatural defenses. Elena raised her hand, power building in her palm like captured lightning. The spell she'd chosen would not just destroy the stone, it would turn its own energy back on itself, creating a feedback loop that would stun every hunter connected to the network. For the sanctuary, she whispered, and released the power she'd been building. The communion stone exploded in a burst of light that temporarily blinded every hunter in the forest. Their leader screamed as the psychic backlash hit him, dropping to his knees as blood ran from his nose and ears. Around the cottage, the other hunters staggered, their perfect coordination shattered. Cinna felt a surge of triumph, but it was short-lived. As the leader struggled to his feet, his eyes found her through the fading concealment spell, and she saw something in his gaze that chilled her to the bone, not just hatred, but recognition. The Guardian awakens, he snarled, raising a weapon that gleamed with silver and something darker. The Brotherhood has waited centuries for this moment. Elena realized with growing horror that they hadn't stumbled upon her cottage by accident. They had been hunting her specifically, and Dimitri's arrival had simply provided the perfect opportunity to destroy both threats to their vision of a purely human world. The cottage felt different when Elena and Dimitri returned from their harrowing escape through the forest. The ancient walls that had sheltered her for 7 years now seemed to pulse with a life of their own, responding to the awakening of her guardian powers. Candlelight flickered from sconces that had lit themselves, and the fire in the hearth burned with flames that cast no shadows. "Tell me about the loneliness," Elena said, as she tended to the fresh wounds Dimitri had sustained during their fight with the hunters. They had managed to drive off the Brotherhood, but not without cost. "You mentioned centuries of it. What is it like to watch the world change while you remain the same?" Dimitri was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting the supernatural flames. "Imagine loving someone with your entire being, knowing that no matter how deep that love runs, you will watch them age and die while you continue on unchanged. Then imagine that happening not once, but dozens of times, until the very act of caring becomes a source of torment." Elena's hands stilled on the bandage she was wrapping around his arm. "Is that why you've remained alone?" "For the past century, yes." Dimitri's voice carried the weight of accumulated sorrows. "I told myself it was easier, safer for everyone if I kept my distance. But distance becomes a prison of its own after a while." Elena found herself sharing something she'd never spoken aloud. I came to this cottage after my fiancé died. James was everything I thought I wanted in life. When he was killed in a car accident 3 days before our wedding, I couldn't bear the thought of risking that kind of loss again. 7 years I've spent hiding from the possibility of pain, and now... Elena looked around the cottage, at the grandmother's books that had revealed her true heritage, at the protective wards that glowed softly in response to her presence, at the man who had brought danger and purpose back into her carefully ordered solitude. Now I think maybe pain is the price we pay for connection, and maybe that connection is worth the cost. Dimitri reached up, his fingers brushing against the silver cross at her throat. As he touched it, Elena felt a jolt of electricity run through her, not painful but intensely intimate, as if he'd touched her soul rather than her skin. "Your pendant," he said with wonder in his voice. "It's not just silver. There's something else in the metal." Elena looked down at the cross her grandmother had given her, seeing it as if for the first time. In the supernatural light of the cottage, she could see that it wasn't pure silver, but an alloy shot through with veins of something that seemed to contain captured moonlight. "Moon crystal," Dimitri identified, his voice filled with awe. "I haven't seen it worked into jewelry for centuries. It's the rarest of supernatural metals, found only in places where the barrier between worlds is thinnest." As Elena examined the pendant more closely, she noticed that it had begun to glow in response to Dimitri's proximity, not with harsh light, but with a soft radiance that seemed to bridge the gap between his supernatural nature and her mortal origins. "What does it mean?" she asked. "Moon crystal only responds to true compatibility between mortal and immortal souls." Dimitri's voice was barely above a whisper. "Your grandmother didn't just prepare you to be a guardian, Elena. She prepared you to be a bridge between our worlds." The revelation hung between them like a suspended breath. Elena found herself moving closer to Dimitri, drawn by forces that seemed to originate in the very foundations of the cottage. When their lips met, the moon crystal pendant blazed with light that filled the entire room, and Elena felt the world shift around them. The kiss was electric, charged with supernatural energy that made every nerve in Elena's body sing with awareness. She could taste centuries of loneliness on Dimitri's lips, could feel the careful walls he'd built around his heart beginning to crumble. In return, she felt him sensing her own isolation, the years of self-imposed exile that had brought her to this moment. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily, and the cottage around them seemed to approve of what had just occurred. The protective wards burned brighter, and Elena could sense that the sanctuary's power had grown stronger, fed by the connection that had just been forged. "Elena," Dimitri said, his voice rough with emotion he'd kept buried for decades, "I need you to understand what this means. What we are to each other goes beyond simple attraction. The moon crystal responding to us, your grandmother's preparations, my being drawn here, it's all connected to something larger than either of us." Elena touched the pendant, feeling its warmth against her skin. "Destiny, partnership. The old treaties between our worlds were sealed by bonds like this, mortal guardians and supernatural. Protectors working together to maintain the balance." Dimitri's eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "If we choose this path, there's no going back. You'll be bound to my world as surely as I'm now bound to yours." Elena looked around the cottage that had been her refuge, feeling the power that flowed through its ancient stones, sensing the possibilities that stretched out before them. "I choose the path forward," she said simply. "I choose us." The blood bond ritual required preparation that stretched into the evening hours. Elena learned that it was not something undertaken lightly. The connection would link their life forces in ways that transcended the merely physical, creating a bridge between mortal and immortal that could never be severed. "The covenant chalice hasn't been used in over 2 centuries. Dimitri explained as he carefully unwrapped an ornate goblet from silk that seemed older than memory. The chalice was carved from a single piece of black stone, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to shift and change in the candlelight. The last guardian to undergo this ritual was in France during the Revolution. Elena traced the intricate patterns with her fingertip, feeling power thrumming beneath the surface of the stone. What happened to her? She and her vampire partner held the supernatural world together while human civilization tore itself apart. They prevented a war that would have revealed our existence to mortals who weren't ready for the truth. Dimitri's voice carried deep respect. They saved countless lives, but the bond demanded everything of them. She lived far longer than any mortal should, and he learned to feel human emotions with an intensity that nearly destroyed him. And you're certain this is what we need to do? Dimitri set the chalice on the table between them, its dark surface reflecting the supernatural flames that now burned continuously in the cottage. The Brotherhood won't stop hunting you now that they know what you are. And there are other threats. Vampire houses that would see you as either a tool to be used or a danger to be eliminated. This bond would place you under my protection while giving you access to power that could save both our peoples. Elena understood the magnitude of what he was offering. The blood bond would transform her in ways she couldn't fully comprehend, tying her fate to his in a connection that would endure beyond death itself. But she also understood that the alternative was to live constantly under threat, unable to fulfill the guardian role her bloodline had prepared her for. "Tell me how it works," she said quietly. Dimitri moved to the cottage's ancient hearth, where flames now burned with colors that had no names in human language. The ritual requires blood from both participants, willingly given and freely accepted. The chalice will mix our essences in ways that create permanent connection. You'll gain enhanced healing, extended lifespan, and the ability to sense supernatural threats from great distances. I'll gain the capacity to feel emotions as mortals do, to be sustained by more than just blood and darkness. As Dimitri spoke, Elena felt power building in the cottage around them. The walls themselves seemed to approve of what was being contemplated, the ancient stones humming with energy that spoke of similar ceremonies performed here generations ago. My grandmother did this, Elena realized with sudden certainty. That's how she knew so much about the supernatural world. She was bonded to someone like you, someone exactly like me. Dimitri's smile held centuries of sadness. Your grandmother and I were partners for nearly 30 years. She was the guardian who taught me that vampires could be more than predators, that we could be protectors instead of destroyers. Elena stared at him. Pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed suddenly falling into place. You loved her. I loved her as a partner, as a friend, as the person who showed me what I could become instead of what I had been. Dimitri's eyes met Elena's. But never as I love you. What I feel for you goes beyond partnership, beyond duty or destiny. It's the kind of love that your grandmother told me would be worth waiting centuries to find. Elena felt tears she hadn't expected burning her eyes. She knew you would come to me. She saw it in visions during her final years. The cottage choosing you as its new guardian. The threats that would emerge requiring both our powers to face. The love that would grow between us. Dimitri took her hands in his, and Elena felt the cold strength there, the potential for both protection and destruction. She made me promise to wait, to let you choose your own path, even if it meant watching you walk away from everything she'd prepared you for. Elena looked around the cottage that had been her sanctuary, feeling the power that flowed through its stones. Sensing the generations of women who had stood where she now stood and made choices that shaped the balance between worlds. The blood bond would change everything, but perhaps change was what she needed, what the world needed. I choose the bond, she said, her voice steady with conviction. I choose to stand with you. Dimitri lifted the covenant chalice, and Elena saw her own reflection in its dark surface, not as she had been, but as she was becoming. Together, they began the ritual that would transform them both forever. The journey to Dimitri's stronghold took 3 nights, traveling through forests that grew darker and more ancient with each mile. Elena felt the changes the blood bond had wrought in her body, enhanced senses that let her see clearly in darkness, strength that surprised her with its intensity, and an awareness of Dimitri's presence that went beyond physical proximity. She could feel his emotions now, the careful control he maintained over centuries of accumulated pain, and beneath it all, a growing wonder at the human feelings the bond had awakened in him. "Tell me about your clan," Elena said, as they approached a mountain that seemed to rise from the earth like a sleeping giant. "What should I expect?" "Suspicion, initially," Dimitri replied honestly. "Vampires are territorial by nature, and many will see your presence as a threat to the established order. There are those who believe humans should remain prey, not partners." As they climbed the winding path that led to the stronghold, Elena began to understand the scope of Dimitri's responsibilities. The fortress carved into the mountain's heart was home to nearly 200 vampires, each one looking to their alpha for protection, guidance, and leadership in a world that grew more hostile to their kind with each passing year. The great hall that served as Dimitri's seat of power took Elena's breath away. Carved from living rock and lit by torches that burned with the same supernatural flames as her cottage hearth, the chamber was dominated by a throne hewn from pure black obsidian. The obsidian throne radiated power that Elena could feel in her bones, not just Dimitri's personal authority, but the accumulated weight of every alpha who had ruled from that seat for over 1,000 years. "My lord," a vampire with silver hair and ancient eyes approached them with fluid grace. "We did not expect your return so soon, or with such unusual company." Elena felt the weight of dozens of stares as vampires throughout the hall turned their attention to her. Some expressions held curiosity, others suspicion, and a few showed open hostility. She straightened her shoulders, drawing on the confidence the blood bond had given her. "This is Elena," Dimitri announced, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. "Guardian of the old bloodline, my bonded partner, and under the protection of this clan." A murmur ran through the assembled vampires. Elena heard fragments of conversation, questions about the possibility of guardians still existing, speculation about what her presence meant for vampire society, and underneath it all, the kind of political maneuvering that seemed universal to any gathering of powerful beings. "A guardian," the silver-haired vampire mused, studying Elena with eyes that had seen the rise and fall of empires. "I am Marcus, Dimitri's second in command. I confess, I thought your kind were legend." "We prefer it that way," Elena replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Legends are safer than targets." Marcus smiled, and Elena caught a glimpse of fangs that gleamed like polished ivory. "Wisdom that has kept your bloodline alive when others have fallen. Tell me, Guardian, what brings you from your sanctuary to our halls?" Before Elena could answer, another voice cut through the conversation, younger, sharper, filled with barely contained aggression. "She brings danger," a dark-haired vampire said, moving through the crowd with predatory grace. "The Brotherhood has been hunting our kind with renewed fervor. Word has reached us of attacks on vampire safe houses, coordinated strikes that suggest they have new intelligence about our movements." Elena felt Dimitri's tension spike through their bond, though his expression remained carefully neutral. "Explain, Cassius." 3 safe houses in the Eastern Territories, all struck within the same night. The attacks were too precise, too coordinated to be chance. Cassius's dark eyes fixed on Elena with obvious suspicion. "And now our alpha returns, with a human who just happens to awaken as a guardian at the same time the Brotherhood escalates their war against us." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Elena felt the mood in the hall shift, suspicion crystallizing into something more dangerous. She realized that many of the vampires gathered here had spent centuries learning to trust only their own kind. and her presence represented a fundamental disruption to that world view. "The Guardian fought beside me against the Brotherhood," Dimitri said, his voice carrying a warning that made several vampires step back. "She destroyed their communion stone and saved both our lives," so she claims, Cassius pressed. "But how do we know this isn't an elaborate deception? How do we know she isn't exactly what the Brotherhood wants us to believe? A Guardian awakened to serve their cause instead of opposing it." Elena felt anger rise in her chest, but also understanding. These vampires had survived for centuries by being suspicious of outsiders, by questioning every alliance and testing every loyalty. She couldn't fault them for applying those same standards to her. "Test me," she said simply, addressing not just Cassius, but the entire assembly. "Whatever trials you use to judge loyalty, whatever challenges you require to prove worthiness, I'll meet them." The celebration feast in Elena's honor had been underway for 2 hours when Marcus approached Dimitri with a goblet of wine that gleamed too brightly in the torchlight. Elena's newly enhanced senses caught the subtle wrongness immediately. The wine's scent carried undertones of metal and something else that made her skin crawl. "A toast," Marcus announced, raising the poisoned goblet toward Dimitri. "To new alliances and old loyalties." Elena moved without conscious thought, her hand intercepting the goblet before Dimitri could take it. The moment her skin touched the metal, pain shot through her arm like liquid fire, but she held on, her guardian instincts screaming warnings that her conscious mind was still learning to interpret. "Interesting," Marcus said, his ancient eyes studying Elena with newfound respect. "The Guardian's bond truly does extend her senses beyond the merely human." The goblet clattered to the stone floor, its contents hissing and smoking where they touched the ancient rock. Around the hall, conversations died as vampires turned to stare at the scene unfolding near the throne. "Silver nitrate," Elena identified, her voice tight with pain as she examined the burns on her palm. "Mixed with something else, wolf's bane, maybe blessed salt." Dimitri's expression had gone cold as winter ice. "Marcus?" "A test, my lord," the silver-haired vampire replied calmly. "You bring us a human claiming to be guardian, bonded to you through ancient ritual, asking us to trust her with our lives and secrets. Surely you understand the need for verification." Elena felt Dimitri's rage through their bond, not at the test itself, but at the deception involved, the casual willingness to poison him in order to evaluate her reactions. She placed a steadying hand on his arm, drawing on the connection between them to project calm. "He's not the only one," she said quietly, her enhanced senses picking up details that would have escaped her mortal perception. "This was planned. Look at how the others are positioned. They're not surprised by what just happened." Dimitri's gaze swept the hall, taking in the careful positioning of various clan members. The way conversations had died too quickly, the expressions that showed anticipation rather than shock. "A conspiracy, not a conspiracy." Cassius stepped forward, his young face showing none of the deference usually accorded to an alpha. "A necessity. You've been gone from the clan for months, Dimitri. Isolated, making decisions without consulting the council. Returning with a human you claim changes everything about our fundamental nature." Elena realized with growing alarm that this went beyond simple suspicion about her identity. The vampires gathered in this hall were questioning Dimitri's leadership itself, using her presence as justification for a challenge that had been building for far longer than the few days since her awakening. "You think I've been compromised," Dimitri said, his voice deadly quiet. "You think the blood bond has made me weak. I think it's made you human," Marcus replied. "And humans are ruled by emotions that cloud judgment. Look at yourself, my lord. When did you last feed properly? When did you last make a decision based on the clan's needs rather than this mortal's safety?" Elena felt Dimitri's shock through their connection as he realized how much his behavior had changed since the bonding ritual. The vampire who had ruled through cold logic and calculated ruthlessness was learning to feel love, compassion, protective instincts that had lain dormant for centuries. "The bond doesn't make him weak," Elena said, stepping forward to address the assembled vampires directly. "It makes him more than he was before. I've seen him fight with power that comes not just from blood and darkness, but from having something worth protecting." "Pretty words," Cassius sneered. "But words won't protect us when the Brotherhood comes calling with weapons designed to end our existence. We need our alpha to be a predator, not a protector." Elena felt something shift in the hall around them. Alliances revealing themselves. Vampires choosing sides in a confrontation that would determine not just Dimitri's leadership, but the future direction of vampire society itself. "Then you need a new alpha," Marcus announced, drawing a blade that gleamed with the same deadly light as the poisoned wine had carried. "One who remembers what we are, what we were born to be." The challenge hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Elena felt Dimitri's anguish through their bond. Not fear of the fight itself, but grief at the betrayal from vampires he had protected and led for decades. She also felt his determination to prove that the bond had made him stronger, not weaker. "Very well," Dimitri said, accepting the challenge with formal words that carried the weight of ancient law. "But know this, I will not die easily. And if you succeed in destroying me, you will face the Guardian's wrath as well." Elena realized that whatever happened next would determine whether the vampire world would accept the partnership between their kinds, or reject it so violently that the old balance could never be restored. The transformation began at midnight, during the confrontation with Marcus, in the ancient combat circle beneath the stronghold. Elena had been watching Dimitri fight with deadly grace, when power beyond anything she'd experienced suddenly erupted from her skin in lines of silver light. The markings appeared like living tattoos, intricate symbols that seemed to write themselves across her arms, her shoulders, her spine. "Impossible," Marcus breathed, his attack faltering as he stared at Elena in shock. Around the combat circle, vampires who had lived for centuries fell to their knees in recognition of something they had thought lost to legend. The bloodline seal, the mark that appeared only on descendants of the original peacekeepers, those mortals who had first negotiated the treaties between the human and supernatural worlds. Elena felt ancient knowledge flooding through her consciousness as each symbol completed itself. Memories that belonged not to her, but to every guardian who had come before. The last guardian bearing the full seal was killed in Salem. An elderly vampire whispered from the circle's edge. "That was 300 years ago. We thought the bloodline had been diluted beyond recovery." Elena looked down at her hands, watching as symbols of power and protection continued to manifest across her skin. Through the blood bond she could feel Dimitri's awe and something else, fear, not of her but for her, as he realized what the appearance of the seal meant. "The prophecies," Marcus said, lowering his weapon entirely. "The old prophecies spoke of a guardian who would arise when the supernatural world faced its greatest threat. One who could unite the feuding species or see them all destroyed in the attempt." Elena felt the power coursing through her veins like liquid starlight, and with it came understanding of her true purpose. She was not just meant to protect the balance between human and supernatural worlds. She was meant to forge a new balance entirely, one that would either save both realms or consume them in the fire of change. The Brotherhood isn't just hunting vampires, she realized aloud, the knowledge arriving like a revelation. They're preparing for a war that will expose the supernatural world to all of humanity. They want to force a confrontation that will end in genocide, ours or theirs. Dimitri moved to her side, his earlier fight with Marcus forgotten in the face of this greater revelation. "How do you know this?" "The seal carries the memories of every guardian before me." Elena touched one of the symbols on her arm, feeling the echo of a woman who had stood against the Inquisition, another who had prevented a vampire war during the Black Death. Dozens of others who had died, protecting the secret that kept both worlds safe. They've tried this before, but never with the level of organization and technology the current Brotherhood possesses. The implications were staggering. If the Brotherhood succeeded in their plan, the careful secrecy that had protected supernatural beings for millennia would be shattered. Humans would learn that vampires, werewolves, and worse things walked among them, leading to a panic that would consume civilization itself. "Then we unite," Dimitri said with sudden resolve. "Every supernatural species, every clan and pack that spent centuries fighting each other. We put aside our differences and face this threat together. They won't listen to vampires," Marcus said, his earlier hostility replaced by grim practicality. "The werewolf packs have hated us for too long. The Fae consider us beneath their notice. The practitioners of magic see us as abominations. But they might listen to her," Dimitri said, looking at Elena with something approaching wonder. "A guardian, bearing the full bloodline seal, speaking with the authority of the original treaties. You could do what no vampire, no single supernatural being could accomplish." Elena felt the weight of destiny settling on her shoulders like a mantle made of stars and shadows. The peaceful life she had built in her cottage, the simple existence she had chosen after losing James, all of it felt like preparation for this moment. But the responsibility was overwhelming. Millions of lives, both human and supernatural. Hanging in the balance of decisions she was only beginning to understand. "There's something else," she said, studying the symbols that continued to appear on her skin. "The seal isn't complete yet. These markings, they're responding to something that hasn't happened. A choice I haven't made. Through their bond, she felt Dimitri's love and fear warring with each other. His desire to protect her conflicting with his understanding that her destiny was larger than either of them could control. "What choice?" he asked quietly. Elena looked around the combat circle, at vampires who had been ready to tear each other apart minutes ago, now united in their awe and terror at what she was becoming. "Whether to save the supernatural world," she said, "or transform it into something entirely new." The war banner of the Brotherhood hung from the cathedral's highest spire like a declaration of genocide. Elena could see it through the scrying mirror Dimitri's clan mage had conjured, its crimson fabric emblazoned with a silver cross that seemed to burn with unholy fire. Beneath that banner, representatives from every major hunter organization in the world had gathered for what their leader called the Final Crusade. "They're not hiding anymore," Elena observed, studying the faces of men and women who had devoted their lives to exterminating supernatural beings. "This is meant to be seen to send a message that they're done with secrecy." Dimitri stood beside her in the Stronghold's war room, his expression grim as reports continued to arrive from vampire scouts across 3 continents. "The scale of this is unprecedented. They've somehow convinced governments that supernatural beings pose an imminent threat to human civilization. Because they're planning to make it true," Elena said, her understanding deepening as more memories from the bloodline seal surfaced. "They're going to stage attacks on human populations, make it look like vampires and werewolves have declared war on humanity. Then they'll present themselves as the only force capable of stopping the threat they created." Marcus, his earlier rebellion replaced by grudging respect for Elena's abilities, spread intelligence reports across the table. "They have weapons we've never seen before. Not just blessed silver, but something that can paralyze supernatural beings entirely. 3 werewolf packs in Europe simply vanished overnight." Elena felt sick as she read through the reports. The Brotherhood had spent decades developing new methods of warfare, technologies that combined religious faith with scientific precision to create weapons capable of ending supernatural life permanently. "We need allies," she said, turning to address the assembled vampires. "Every supernatural species they're targeting. But more than that, we need human allies. People who understand that the Brotherhood's vision of purity will destroy both our worlds. Humans who work with supernatural beings are branded as traitors, Cassius pointed out. The Brotherhood has made cooperation with our kind a capital offense in their doctrine. Then we find the humans who are already branded as traitors, Elena replied. Scholars who've studied the supernatural, government officials who know the truth about our existence, religious leaders who preach tolerance instead of hatred. Dimitri activated a communication crystal that connected to vampire strongholds around the world. As images flickered to life in the air above the table, Elena saw the scope of what they were facing, not just the Brotherhood, but the fear and hatred they had cultivated in human populations for generations. The werewolf clans have agreed to meet, reported a vampire lord from the American territories. They're desperate enough to consider an alliance with vampires, though their pride makes it difficult. What about the Fey courts? Elena asked. The Winter Court has sealed their borders entirely, came the reply from a vampire scout in Northern Europe. The Summer Court is considering their options. They're not convinced this is their fight. Elena felt frustration building inside her. Every supernatural species was reacting to the threat in isolation, falling back on centuries of mistrust and territorial disputes when unity was their only hope for survival. Show them this, she said, pressing her palm to the communication crystal. Power flowed through her connection to the network. Carrying the visions the bloodline seal had shown her, glimpses of a future where the Brotherhood's crusade succeeded, where supernatural beings were hunted to extinction and the human world descended into paranoid chaos. The reactions were immediate and visceral. Vampire lords who had lived through world wars recoiled from the images of systematic genocide. Werewolf alphas who had never shown fear in battle trembled at visions of their packs burning in technological ovens designed to contain and incinerate supernatural creatures. This is what they're planning, Elena continued, her voice carrying the authority of prophecy. Not just our deaths, but the complete eradication of magic from the world. They want to create a reality where only one species, their version of humanity, has the right to exist. And if we fight back, Dimitri said quietly, if we're forced to defend ourselves against their weapons and their armies, we prove their point. We become the monsters they've always claimed we were. Elena nodded grimly. That's the trap they've set. Fight and be branded as the threat they say we are. Hide and be systematically exterminated. There's only one option they haven't accounted for, which is... Elena looked around the war room, at vampires who had spent centuries viewing other supernatural species as competitors or enemies, at the communication crystals connecting them to beings who had never cooperated on anything more significant than maintaining secrecy. We do something no one expects, she said. We reveal ourselves to the human world on our own terms before they can control the narrative. We show humanity that supernatural beings aren't their enemies. We're their neighbors, their protectors, their partners in building a world where both magic and technology can thrive. The silence that followed was deafening. Elena had just proposed the one thing that every supernatural being had been taught was forbidden, the complete abandonment of the secrecy that had protected their kinds for millennia. The eclipse crown arrived at the stronghold 3 days before the lunar eclipse, carried by a delegation of Fae who materialized from the autumn air like living poetry. Elena had never seen anything like the artifact, a circlet of intertwined silver and obsidian that seemed to contain captured starlight, its surface shifting between solid metal and something that looked like crystallized moonbeams. The crown has not been worn for over 1,000 years, explained Titania, queen of the Summer Court, her voice carrying the music of wind through golden leaves. The last guardian to claim it united the supernatural realms against a demon incursion that would have consumed both our worlds. Elena approached the crown with reverence, feeling power radiate from it in waves that made her bloodline seal respond with increasing intensity. The symbols on her skin began to glow as she drew near, creating patterns of light that reflected and amplified the crown's own luminescence. "What will it do to me?" she asked, though part of her already knew from the memories that continued to surface from her guardian heritage. "It will make you what you were always meant to become," Dimitri said quietly, standing beside her in the stronghold's highest chamber. Through their bond, Elena could feel his mixture of pride and terror at what she was about to undertake. The focal point for every supernatural alliance, the bridge between species that have been enemies for millennia. The supernatural alliance that had gathered in response to Elena's call was unprecedented in both scope and fragility. Vampire lords who had spent centuries in blood feuds with werewolf alphas now stood in the same chamber, united only by their fear of the Brotherhood's final solution. They nobles who considered most other beings beneath their notice worked alongside, practitioners of human magic who had hidden their abilities for generations. "The eclipse begins in 6 hours, announced Dr. Sarah Chen, one of the human allies Elena had managed to recruit, a government scientist who had been secretly documenting supernatural phenomena for decades. "Our intelligence suggests the Brotherhood will begin their coordinated attacks the moment totality begins. They believe the eclipse will amplify their blessed weapons while weakening supernatural defenses." "They're partially correct," admitted Magnus, an ancient vampire whose knowledge of celestial magic dated back to the Roman Empire. "The eclipse will indeed amplify supernatural energies, but it amplifies all of them, not just those aligned with their particular interpretation of divine will." Elena studied the eclipse crown, feeling prophecies stirring in her mind like half-remembered dreams. The visions showed her fragments of what was coming, battles fought in darkness that would determine the fate of 2 worlds. Choices that would either preserve the ancient balance or shatter it forever. "There's something you're not telling me," she said to Titania, sensing evasion in the Fey Queen's luminous eyes. "The crown comes with a price, doesn't it?" Titania's expression grew solemn. "The guardian who wears the eclipse crown during totality becomes a conduit for power beyond mortal comprehension. That power can reshape reality itself, rewrite the fundamental laws that govern the relationship between species." She paused, her voice heavy with ancient sadness. "But mortal minds were not designed to channel such forces. Every guardian who has worn the crown has been changed by the experience. Changed how? Some became more than human, but less than mortal. Beings of pure purpose who lost the capacity for personal desire or individual love. Others burned out entirely, their consciousness scattered across the spiritual realm." Titania met Elena's eyes directly. "And some simply disappeared, transformed into something so alien that they could no longer exist in any world we understand." Elena felt Dimitri's anguish spike through their bond. He had found love after centuries of isolation, only to face the possibility of losing her to a transformation that might preserve her power but destroy everything that made her herself. "Is there another way?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Not if we want to prevent the Brotherhood from succeeding," Elena replied, her understanding of the situation crystallizing with terrible clarity. "They've positioned themselves to win any conventional conflict. Our only chance is to change the nature of the conflict itself." She reached for the eclipse crown, feeling its weight settle on her brow like destiny made manifest. Power immediately began flowing through her, connecting her to every supernatural being in the stronghold and beyond. Through the network of alliances she had forged, Elena could sense the entire supernatural world, millions of beings holding their breath, waiting to see if this desperate gamble would save them or damn them all. "The eclipse begins soon," she said, her voice now carrying harmonics that hadn't been there before. "It's time to return to where this all started. It's time to make our stand at the cottage, where the old ways have been preserved, where the first treaties were written, where the future of both our worlds will be decided." The battle erupted as the eclipse reached totality, transforming Elena's peaceful cottage sanctuary into a war zone, where ancient magic clashed with blessed weaponry. The Brotherhood had come in force, not just hunters, but military units equipped with weapons that screamed when they fired, their ammunition designed to cause maximum pain to supernatural flesh. Elena stood at the cottage's threshold, the eclipse crown blazing with power that turned night into something beyond day or darkness. Through its amplified connection, she could coordinate the supernatural alliance's defense, while simultaneously maintaining the protective barriers that kept the cottage itself from being overrun. Eastern Perimeter Breach. Dimitri's voice reached her through their bond as he led a strike team of vampires against a Brotherhood flanking maneuver. Elena could feel his movements through their connection, fluid, deadly grace, as he fought with weapons that could end his existence permanently. If they found their mark, the shattered mirror of truth materialized in the air above the battlefield, its crystalline surface revealing the true nature of every combatant. Where Brotherhood soldiers appeared as men driven by righteous fury, the mirror showed the reality, beings consumed by hatred so pure it had burned away their humanity, leaving only the desire to destroy anything different from themselves. They're not human anymore, Elena realized with horror, watching the mirror's revelations. The Brotherhood's conditioning, their blessed weapons, it's transformed them into something as inhuman as they claim we are. Through the Eclipse Crown's expanded awareness, Elena sensed the werewolf packs engaging Brotherhood forces on the northern approach. The wolves fought with savage efficiency, but the hunters' new weapons disrupted their shape-shifting abilities, forcing them to battle in forms that were neither fully human nor fully wolf. "Guardian!" Titania's voice rang across the battlefield as the Fey Queen materialized in a whirlwind of autumn leaves and starlight. The Brotherhood's siege engines approach from the south. They carry weapons that could shatter the cottage's fundamental protections. Elena turned her enhanced senses toward the approaching threat, feeling her heart sink as she perceived what was coming. The Brotherhood had somehow weaponized faith itself, creating artillery that fired shells of concentrated belief, not belief in anything divine, but belief in the absolute necessity of supernatural extinction. "Dimitri," she called through their bond, "fall back to the cottage. We need to make our stand here." As the supernatural alliance consolidated their defense around the sanctuary, Elena felt the true weight of what the Eclipse Crown was demanding of her. The power flowing through the artifact was reshaping her consciousness, expanding her awareness beyond individual concerns towards something vast and cosmic. She could feel herself becoming less Elena and more Guardian, a being of pure purpose designed to preserve the balance between worlds. But with that transformation came devastating clarity about their situation. The Brotherhood hadn't come just to destroy the supernatural alliance. They had come to force Elena into a choice that would damn her, regardless of what she decided. "Look at what you've done," the Brotherhood's leader called out, his voice amplified by some supernatural means as he approached under a flag of parley. Elena recognized him from the cottage's protective mirrors, Commander Harrison, the man who had unified every hunter organization under his banner of absolute extermination. "You've proven our point better than any propaganda ever could," Harrison continued, gesturing to the battlefield where supernatural beings fought with inhuman abilities against armed humans. When humanity sees recordings of this battle, werewolves tearing apart soldiers, vampires feeding on the wounded, wielding powers that violate the laws of physics, they'll beg us to complete the cleansing we've started. Elena felt the trap closing around them with mechanical precision. If the Supernatural Alliance won this battle, the Brotherhood would broadcast footage that made them look like the monsters humanity needed protection from. If they lost, the systematic genocide would proceed unopposed. "There is a third option," Elena called back, the Eclipse Crown's power allowing her voice to carry clearly across the battlefield. "One you haven't considered, because you can't imagine a world where your vision of purity doesn't prevail." "Enlighten me," Harrison replied mockingly. Elena felt the crown's power building towards something that would either save both worlds or transform them beyond recognition. Through the shattered mirror of truth, she could see the potential futures spreading out like branches on an infinite tree, realities where humanity and supernatural beings coexisted, worlds where they were forever separated, timelines where both species evolved into something entirely new. "I choose transformation," Elena said, her voice now carrying harmonics that made reality itself listen. "Not just for the supernatural world, but for all of us." The eclipse crown erupted with light that made the moon's eclipse look dim by comparison. And Elena felt herself beginning the change that would either preserve everything she loved or sacrifice it for something greater than love itself. Elena felt herself dissolving. As the eclipse crown's power reached its crescendo, her consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of individual identity towards something vast and interconnected. Through the transformative energy, she could see every thread that connected the supernatural and human worlds, threads of fear, love, hatred, wonder, all tangled together in a pattern that had been slowly strangling both realms for centuries. The heart's firestone materialized in her hands without conscious summoning, its crystalline surface reflecting not light but pure emotion made visible. Elena understood now why her grandmother had hidden this artifact so carefully. It was the key to the transformation that could save both worlds, but only if wielded by someone willing to sacrifice everything personal for universal love. "Elena," Dimitri's voice reached her through the maelstrom of power, filled with anguish as he felt her slipping away through their bond. "Don't leave me. Don't become something I can't follow." But Elena was already beyond the reach of individual pleas. The eclipse crown had made her a conduit for forces that operated on scales measured in epochs rather than lifetimes. Through the heart's firestone, she could feel the love that existed between every being on the battlefield, not just romantic love, but the fundamental connection that linked all conscious creatures in a web of shared existence. This is what the first guardian saw, she realized, her voice now speaking in harmonics that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The truth that fear has hidden for so long: we are not separate species competing for survival. We are facets of the same cosmic consciousness, artificial divisions created by millennia of misunderstanding. The heart's firestone began to pulse with increasing intensity, its light reaching every combatant on the battlefield. Where the radiance touched Brotherhood soldiers, Elena saw their conditioning beginning to crack, the hatred that had been programmed into them dissolving as they remembered what it felt like to love instead of fear. "Impossible," Commander Harrison snarled, raising a weapon that gleamed with concentrated faith. "You cannot undo divine will with parlor tricks and sentiment." "Divine will," Elena replied, her expanding consciousness now encompassing perspectives that included both mortal and eternal viewpoints. "Is love without condition, acceptance without judgment, growth without destruction. You have mistaken fear for faith, control for purpose." Elena felt the moment of ultimate choice approaching, the decision that would determine whether her transformation preserved the individuals she loved or absorbed them into something greater. Through the blood bond, she could feel Dimitri's terror as he realized she was becoming something that might save the world but could no longer love him as a separate being. But love, Elena discovered, was more powerful than even cosmic transformation. The heart's firestone responded not to her expanding consciousness, but to the specific, individual, imperfect love she felt for Dimitri. Love that included his flaws, his darkness, his capacity for both protection and destruction. "I choose both," she declared, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had touched infinity and chosen to remain finite. Transformation and preservation, unity and individuality. "I choose to become something new while remaining who I am." The heart's firestone exploded with light that rewrote the fundamental rules governing supernatural existence. Instead of forcing unity through absorption, it created connections that preserved individual identity while allowing genuine understanding between species. Vampires could feel the warmth of human emotion without losing their essential nature. Humans could comprehend supernatural perspectives without surrendering their mortality. Werewolves, fae, practitioners of magic, all remained themselves while gaining the ability to truly understand each other. Elena felt herself solidifying back into individual form, but she was no longer merely human or merely guardian. The transformation had made her something unprecedented, a bridge consciousness that could exist as both separate being and universal. Connection, the brotherhood's weapons, she realized with dawning joy. They're powerless now. You can't destroy what you fundamentally are. Across the battlefield, hunters found their blessed ammunition turning to flower petals, their consecrated blades becoming instruments of healing rather than harm. The hatred that had driven them was not destroyed but transformed, redirected, toward genuine threats to peace rather than beings who simply existed. Differently, Elena felt Dimitri's arms around her as consciousness fully returned to her individual body, felt his tears of relief as he realized she had found a way to save both worlds without sacrificing their love. "The old balance is broken," she whispered against his chest, feeling the heart's firestone's warmth spread through the cottage's foundations and beyond. But something better has taken its place. Through the transformed bond that now connected all conscious beings, Elena felt the dawn of an age where supernatural and mortal could coexist, not through secrecy or fear, but through understanding and shared purpose. The morning after the eclipse brought a world transformed in ways both subtle and profound. Elena stood in her cottage garden, watching as flowers that had never grown in this climate bloomed. Alongside her grandmother's roses, a physical manifestation of the new connections. Between realms that had previously existed in isolation, the dawn scepter had appeared at sunrise, materializing from the intersection of silver moonlight and golden dawn, where Elena's transformation had reached its completion. Crafted from both silver and obsidian, it represented her new role as mediator between worlds that could now coexist openly. "The governments are in chaos," Dr. Chen reported during the morning briefing that had become Elena's new reality. Satellite footage of the battle, recordings of the transformation. They can't deny the existence of the supernatural world anymore. But instead of panic, we're seeing curiosity. Elena nodded, unsurprised. The heart's firestone's influence had spread far beyond the battlefield, touching human consciousness with the understanding that supernatural beings were not threats to be eliminated, but neighbors to be acknowledged. Fear remained, but it was balanced now by wonder and the genuine possibility of cooperation. Dimitri joined her in the garden, moving with the same predatory grace he'd always possessed, but tempered now by something warmer. The blood bond between them had evolved during the transformation, becoming deeper and more complex while remaining essentially theirs. "The vampire clans are adapting better than expected," he said, settling beside her on the bench where they'd shared their first real conversation. "Some of the older lords are struggling with the concept of coexistence, but the younger vampires are embracing it. Marcus wants to establish formal diplomatic relations with the human governments. And the werewolf packs? 3 alphas have already reached out about establishing protected territories where both human and wolf communities can thrive." Dimitri's smile carried genuine warmth now. Emotions that the blood bond had awakened in him, made richer by his connection to Elena's transformed consciousness. "They're calling them harmony zones." Elena examined the dawn scepter more closely, feeling the power it contained. Not the overwhelming cosmic force of the eclipse crown, but something more manageable, designed for the daily work of building bridges rather than rewriting reality. "There will be challenges," she said thoughtfully. "Humans who can't accept the new reality, Supernatural beings who preferred the old ways. Conflicts between species that have centuries of bad blood to overcome. But now we have a framework for resolving those conflicts without warfare, Dimitri pointed out. Your transformation didn't just change the supernatural world. It gave both species the tools to understand each other. Genuinely, the cottage itself had become something unprecedented, no longer just a sanctuary for those fleeing the human world, but a meeting place where both realms could come together safely. Elena could sense delegations already traveling toward them from every corner of the earth, seeking guidance on how to navigate this new reality. Commander Harrison wants to meet with you, Dr. Chen added, consulting her tablet with an expression of barely concealed amazement. The former Brotherhood leader has apparently undergone what he's calling a fundamental reassessment of divine purpose. He's requesting permission to establish a new organization, one dedicated to protecting supernatural human cooperation rather than preventing it. Elena wasn't entirely surprised. The heart's fire, Stone's transformation had been most dramatic in those whose hatred had burned brightest, converting that intensity into equally powerful love and protection. Harrison's military precision and organizational skills, redirected toward building peace instead of waging war, could become one of their greatest assets. The Fey courts have sent formal invitations, Dimitri continued. Both summer and winter want to establish permanent embassies in the human world. Titania is particularly interested in cultural exchange programs. Elena felt a deep satisfaction settling in her chest. The future spreading out before them wasn't without complications, but it was filled with possibilities that would have been unthinkable just days ago. Supernatural beings could emerge from the shadows without fear of persecution. Humans could explore the magical aspects of existence without risking their lives or sanity. What about us? Dimitri asked quietly, his voice carrying a vulnerability that the old vampire lord would never have allowed himself to show. In all this building of new worlds and bridging of ancient divides, what happens to what we've found together? Elena took his hand, feeling the blood bond pulse between them with renewed strength. The transformation had shown her cosmic love, universal connection, the vast web of consciousness that linked all beings. But it had also confirmed that individual love, specific and chosen and imperfect, was the foundation that made all other connections possible. We grow together, she said simply. We build this new world side by side, and we make sure that in all our grand plans for species harmony, we never forget what it means to love just one person completely. 6 months after the eclipse that changed everything, Elena stood before the unity tapestry that had materialized in the cottage's expanded great hall, a magical weaving that recorded every alliance, every peace treaty, every act of cooperation between species that had once viewed each other as mortal enemies. The tapestry grew daily, new threads of gold and silver, appearing as relationships formed that would have been impossible in the old world. The werewolf delegation from Montana just confirmed their territory agreement with the local ranching community, Dr. Chen announced, updating the digital records that now worked alongside the tapestry's magical documentation. Shared grazing rights in exchange for protection from what they're calling traditional predators. Elena smiled, running her fingers along a section of the tapestry that depicted vampires and human scientists working together on medical research. Dimitri's enhanced healing abilities, when properly understood through human scientific methods, had led to breakthrough treatments for diseases that had plagued humanity for centuries. Any word from the European Fey courts? She asked, noting a new pattern beginning to form in the tapestry's lower section. The Winter Court has established their first embassy in Prague, Dimitri replied, joining her in the hall that had once been just her grandmother's simple kitchen. Titania says the human artists are fascinated by Fey techniques for working with living materials. Apparently, there's a sculpture garden growing in the embassy courtyard. That's becoming quite the tourist attraction. The cottage itself had grown to accommodate its new role as the unofficial capital of supernatural human relations. What had once been a simple sanctuary now housed meeting halls, research facilities, and living quarters for the steady stream of diplomats, scholars, and curious individuals from both worlds who sought to understand the new reality. Elena's own transformation had stabilized into something remarkable. She remained fundamentally herself, but with expanded awareness that allowed her to serve as interpreter between species whose thought processes had evolved along completely different lines. The Dawn's scepter helped her channel this ability without becoming overwhelmed by the cosmic perspective that had nearly consumed her during the eclipse. The harmony zones are exceeding all projections, Marcus reported during their weekly council meeting. The former vampire conspirator had become one of their most effective ambassadors, his centuries of political experience proving invaluable in navigating the complex negotiations required to establish peaceful coexistence. We have 17 operational zones across North America, 12 in Europe, and the first experimental zone in Asia launching next month. He continued, crime rates in these areas have actually decreased, having supernatural beings openly involved in community. Protection seems to be more effective than anyone anticipated. Elena felt deep satisfaction as she reviewed the reports. The harmony zones weren't just successful experiments in coexistence. They were becoming models for a new kind of community where human technology and supernatural abilities complemented each other naturally. What about the resistance movements? Dimitri asked, his expression growing serious. Not every human had embraced the new reality, and not every supernatural being had abandoned the old ways of secrecy and separation. Smaller than expected, less organized than feared, Dr. Chen replied. The Heart's Firestone's influence seems to have reached further than we initially understood. Even those who oppose cooperation intellectually find it difficult to maintain hatred when they actually encounter supernatural beings personally. Elena nodded, though she remained vigilant about the potential for conflict. The transformation had created a foundation for peace, but building lasting harmony would require constant work from individuals committed to understanding rather than simply tolerance. There's something else, Titania announced as she materialized in the hall with her characteristic swirl of seasonal energy. The other guardians are awakening. Elena felt her breath catch. Other guardians? Your transformation resonated across spiritual dimensions. Bloodlines that had been dormant for centuries are beginning to manifest guardian abilities. We've confirmed 3 awakening in different continents, with possibly more to come. The implications were staggering. Elena had assumed she was the last of her kind, the final guardian charged with either preserving or transforming the balance between worlds. But if others were awakening, it suggested that the changes she'd initiated were far from complete, that the transformation was just the beginning of something much larger. They'll need training, Dimitri said. His protective instincts immediately focused on these unknown guardians who would face the same overwhelming awakening Elena had experienced. They'll need guidance, Elena corrected gently. And they'll need to understand that their power comes not from standing apart from both worlds, but from choosing to bridge them through love rather than duty alone. As evening settled over the cottage, Elena and Dimitri walked through the expanded gardens, where plants from every climate and supernatural realm now grew in impossible harmony. The Unity Tapestry continued its patient weaving in the hall behind them, recording each small act of cooperation that was slowly rebuilding. Civilization on foundations of understanding rather than fear. The wedding ceremony took place at sunset on the anniversary of the eclipse that had changed everything, with representatives from every supernatural species and human delegation, bearing witness to a union that symbolized the new world they had all helped create. Elena stood in her grandmother's garden, now expanded to include groves of silver trees, gifted by the fae and flowering vines that grew naturally between the mortal and immortal. realms. The eternal flame burned at the center of the ceremony, a mystical fire that had ignited spontaneously. When Elena and Dimitri spoke their vows, unlike ordinary flame, this one cast no shadows, and its light seemed to strengthen rather than diminish with time. Elena knew it would burn forever in their sanctuary, a symbol of love that had transcended every barrier between their worlds. "When I lived alone in this cottage," Elena said, addressing not just Dimitri, but the assembled gathering that included werewolf alphas, vampire lords, fey nobility, and human diplomats, "I thought isolation was safety. I believed that if I loved nothing, I could lose nothing. But love isn't about avoiding loss. It's about accepting that connection is worth whatever pain it might bring." Dimitri took her hands, his touch warm despite his vampire nature, the blood bond between them pulsing with a contentment that seemed to spread outward, touching every being present with its certainty. "For centuries, I told myself that immortality was a curse because it meant watching everything I cared about fade away. But immortality is only a curse if you waste it on loneliness. Elena has taught me that eternity has meaning when you spend it building something worth preserving." The words of their bonding ceremony were spoken in multiple languages, human tongues. The musical speech of the Fae, the complex harmonics that vampires used for their most sacred rituals. As each vow was completed, the eternal flame grew brighter, and Elena felt the magic that had transformed them both, deepening into something permanent and unshakable. "Do you understand what you're creating here?" Titania asked after the formal ceremony, her voice carrying the wisdom of ages as she watched Elena and Dimitri dance to music that blended human instruments with supernatural harmonies. "This marriage isn't just a personal commitment. It's a living treaty between your species." Elena looked around the celebration, seeing vampire younglings playing games with human children under the supervision of werewolf guardians who had appointed themselves protectors of the innocent, regardless of species. Former Brotherhood soldiers shared drinks with the Fae while comparing stories of battles fought and peace earned. The cottage's expanded grounds had become a microcosm of the world they were all working to build. "I understand that love has consequences beyond the people who feel it," Elena replied. "But I also understand that those consequences can be beautiful if we're brave enough to let them unfold." As the celebration continued into the night, Elena and Dimitri found quiet moments to reflect on the journey that had brought them together. The cottage around them hummed with protective magic that had evolved far beyond her grandmother's original wards. It was now a living symbol of what cooperation between worlds could accomplish. "Do you ever miss it?" Dimitri asked as they stood together in the workshop where Elena still kept her grandmother's tools and books. "The simplicity of your life before I knocked on your door?" Elena considered the question seriously, looking around the space that had once contained only her solitary projects and now served as a laboratory where human craftsmen worked, alongside supernatural artisans to create things that neither species could have imagined alone. "I miss the safety of it sometimes," she admitted, "but I don't miss the emptiness. I thought I was living, but I was just existing. What we have now, what we've built together, this is what living actually means." The eternal flame continued to burn in the garden outside, visible through every window of the cottage, a reminder that some things were truly permanent. Elena had learned that love didn't make you vulnerable. It made you strong enough to be vulnerable and still keep going. As they prepared for bed in the cottage that was now truly their home, Elena felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had found not just love, but purpose that would endure beyond any single lifetime. The guardians awakening around the world would face their own challenges, their own choices between isolation and connection, but they would not face them alone. Outside their window, the eternal flame burned bright against the darkness, a beacon for anyone still searching for the courage to open their door when love knocked. Wearing the face of everything they had been taught to fear, but might learn to trust instead.